Students, this video lesson is on section 2 and 3 of chapter 3 on the biosphere. By the end of class today, you should be able to define the primary producers in any ecosystem and give some examples, and be able to explain how consumers obtain energy and nutrients. The key terms that will be due for your next Quizlet are autotroph, primary producer, heterotroph, and consumer. So what exactly are primary producers? If you think of that word primary, that has an important meaning in this case. It's the number one, the producer of any given ecosystem. And we know that all organisms need energy. They need energy for growth. They need energy to develop. They need energy to be able to reproduce. So energy is an important survival need for any type of organism. However, not all organisms obtain the energy in the same way. This second bullet is a very important concept. There's a law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics tells us that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It can only be transformed from one source to another, which means that any organism cannot create their own energy. They can only take it in one form and convert it into another form. The autotrophs is another key term here, which means to use chemicals or solar energy to produce organic compounds like carbohydrates, like glucose from inorganic compounds. So autotrophs have this great ability to capture energy in their environment, whether it's light energy, potentially from the sun, or using chemicals in their environment, such as in a swamp, in the sediment of a swamp, or in the bottom of the world's oceans, in hydrothermal vents where underground volcanoes are releasing gases. They're using those chemicals and they're creating glucose from that energy plus whatever is available to them in their environment. Now, primary producers are the types of autotrophs. Again, they're the first producers that are going to be making these organic molecules, making glucose that eventually will flow to all the other organisms in the environment, making up any ecosystem, any biome in the world. So primary producers are critical to the survival of life on our planet. Even if an organism doesn't directly eat a primary producer, it's going to depend on a primary producer for its energy. And the most common types of autotrophs are those organisms that undergo photosynthesis, where they're converting light energy into chemical energy. This would be an example of plants, algae, and some photosynthetic bacteria. So to say that all autotrophs are photosynthetic is not actually correct, because there is a category of autotrophs that are able to take in energy from their environment in the form of inorganic molecules, and are able to convert them into carbohydrates. So as I mentioned before, in the bottom of the world's oceans where there's no light, there is a rich community of life down there because there are gases escaping from the crust of the earth through these underwater volcanoes, and autotrophic organisms that use chemosynthesis are able to capture the energy held in those elements, and they use them almost like light to convert that energy into carbohydrates, so that energy now can begin to flow through the ecosystem. Now, consumers are probably what we're all more familiar with, and certainly are more interesting in many ways. We also know consumers as heterotrophs. So hetero meaning different, troph meaning to feed, so a different way to feed. And these organisms must get their energy from consuming other organisms. So the list that's coming up is something you'll be very familiar with. So these consumers, these heterotrophs, including ourselves, can be classified by how they actually acquire this energy and nutrients. So, for example, we have herbivores. Herbivores only eat producers. Another way you could say that herbivores eat only autotrophs, whereas omnivores eat both producers and other consumers. So in other words, they eat both autotrophs and other heterotrophs. And carnivores eat other consumers. They do not eat any plant material, any autotrophs. Now, the next three categories of acquiring energy are really, really important to ecosystems, because without them, the organic matter held in life that is no longer alive would stay in that body and would never be released back to the environment. So the first category of organisms that can release nutrients back to the environment are decomposers. They do their job by chemically breaking down organic matter. What does that mean? Well, here's an example of some mushrooms down here in the bottom of the bottom picture. Most of the mass of a mushroom, of a fungus, is underground, and their cells are releasing hydrolytic enzymes that break down organic material, and then they basically suck that back into their cells. But without them, we would have a lot of material in a forest, for example, just piling up without being released back to the environment. Detrivores, or I call them the feeders, the garbage feeders of the ecosystem. Basically, they're feeding on the garbage within the ecosystem, meaning the material that breaks down, they're doing that breaking down. And a lot of times we associate detrivores with organisms that feed on what they live on. So, for example, think of a caterpillar feeding on leaves. It lives in the leaves, it feeds on them. And in many streams, we have a lot of aquatic insects that will feed on the leaves that fall into the stream. They'll actually live on them. So a lot of times I kind of associate detrivores with organisms that feed on what they live on, and they're releasing those nutrients back to the environment, just like decomposers. And the last ones are scavengers. Scavengers, there's a whole wide group of scavengers out there in different ecosystems. Great example for a local would be a vulture. We see them all the time, finding a deer carcass on the side of the road. Good example in a marine environment would be a crab feeding on any type of food it can get its claws on, literally. So these consumers are really important part of any type of ecosystem, because these decomposers, these detrivores, these scavengers help to release nutrients back to the environment that eventually the autotrophs will use to pass on to herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores. Moving on to section 3, entitled Energy Flow in Ecosystems. By the end of this video lesson, you should be able to explain how energy flows through ecosystems. You should be able to compare and contrast how our food chains and how our food webs similar and different. And lastly, describe the 3 types of ecological pyramids. Your key terms that we do in your Quizlet, you can do one Quizlet for section 2 and 3 in this case, would be food chain, phytoplankton, zooplankton, food web, trophic level, ecological pyramid, and biomass. Food chains and food webs. Think of the flow of energy in any ecosystem as like a one-way street. Energy can only flow in one direction, and it flows from primary producers to consumers. Now, if we wanted to diagram how energy flow occurs, we could create food chains, which are defined as a single pathway of energy transfer. In other words, if we look at the middle picture here, in this particular example of the food chain, the autotroph, the primary producer of green algae, photosynthetic, is passing on its energy to the brine shrimp that are eating it. The brine shrimp are eaten by perch, which means the energy is flowing from the brine shrimp to the perch. And lastly, the energy in the perch is passed on to the kingfisher as it's wading along the shoreline eating fish. And notice how I have some arrows here, meaning that this energy that's held within any of these organisms can eventually be returned to the environment by these detrivores, by scavengers, by decomposers. The pictures I have up here at the top are just a beautiful collection of different types of microscopic organisms that live in any water body, whether it's a lake, a pond, the ocean, and they comprise a group of organisms called plankton. If we're talking about phytoplankton, think of that word phyto, plant-like floating organisms in any aquatic ecosystem. And many phytoplankton really are the primary producers of an ocean, of a lake, of a pond. A lot of times the rooted plants, the floating plants that we see are not the main producers, not the primary producers, although they play a huge role for the ecosystem. And the organisms that feed on these phytoplankton, these floating microscopic organisms, are called zooplankton. Think of that word zoo, so animal-like plankton. So they are heterotrophs, whereas phytoplankton would be considered autotrophs. And again, lastly, in any ecosystem, we don't often draw food chains that end up in a decomposer or in a scavenger or a detrivore, but it's important to note that the energy just doesn't end with a kingfisher. It can be passed on to some other organism that eventually will break down that top level apex, sometimes predator in an ecosystem, because ecosystems need that energy to be returned to, I didn't say energy, they need that nutrients to be returned to the environment. Because remember, energy flows in one direction, and energy cannot be recycled. So although living matter, all those elements we'll learn about carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, can be rearranged and returned to the environment to be taken by autotrophs, but that energy will be lost to the environment over time. And one really important concept we talk about ecology, this concept of feeding relationships, and this term that goes along with feeding relationships will be trophic level. So in any food chain, in any food web, in any ecosystem, we have a group of organisms that feed in a similar manner. For example, you have producers in an environment, you have autotrophs, you have many different types. In any given forest, there can be many types of trees, many types of plants on the ground. And in some cases, if a pond or pool of water is in that forest, we might have some photosynthetic bacteria or algae living in that area. So you have a lot of producers in an ecosystem. They would be considered all part of one trophic level, and that, of course, would be the base of a pyramid as we begin to kind of diagram these different feeding relationships. Then another level of feeding relationships might be all of the herbivores in a given ecosystem. So they would all be part of a trophic level, and that would be considered the first trophic level, the primary consumers feeding on those primary producers. And then we might go up to, say, some omnivores could make another trophic level, and eventually at the top of any food web, food chain, is going to be the predatory animals that make up that sometimes third or fourth level. And one way to diagram these different feeding relationships, to diagram these trophic levels, is using a pyramid to show how that energy, how that matter is being transferred from one trophic level to the next. So think about a pyramid, very wide at its base, and gets narrower as we move to the top of the pyramid. That's important because energy, as I mentioned before, is often lost during the actual feeding of an animal. When an animal is trying to digest some of that food, whatever way that does that, a lot of that energy is lost in the form of heat that the animal cannot retain. It's like a car engine. Once we turn the car engine on, the gasoline is being burned in the combustion chamber. A lot of that energy in the gasoline molecules is not captured and turned into mechanical energy, the spinning of the wheels. A lot of it's lost to heat, and all you have to do is put your hand on the engine or on the hood, and you can feel the heat coming off the engine. Just like in an ecosystem, you can see in this pyramid here we have heat coming out of each trophic level. And notice the numbers here: 100%, 10%, 1%, 0.1%. So this represents a specific type of ecological pyramid, an energy pyramid, where we're actually showing the amount of energy found in a trophic level, and then how much of that energy is passed up to the next trophic level. So we can clearly see that in an energy pyramid, when the producers, whether they're photosynthetic or chemosynthetic, when they capture that energy, they have 100% of energy is held within their tissues, within their cells. Only about 10% is passed on to the herbivores. 90% of that energy is lost in heat. 10% of the energy found in all of the primary consumers, those herbivores, is passed on to the next level. And then another 10% will be passed on to the top, the third level, meaning now there's only 0.1% left. So this helps explain why we don't have many different trophic levels. Many times we only have 3 or maybe 4 trophic levels. We can't go any higher because there's not enough energy to support any big level predators. Another type of pyramid would be a pyramid of biomass. So we could simply replace the energy with weight. So we might measure in kilograms. And interestingly enough, in the African side, with all these huge animals, the greatest mass of all life is found in the primary producers because they are the ones that start the energy transfer up the food chain. And the last one would be a pyramid of numbers. And you might see an example down here. We have 10,000 freshwater shrimp. I think the reason why we don't see a producer at the bottom of this ecological pyramid, it's very difficult to count all of the algal cells, all of the plants in a pond or in a lake in this case. But we start out with 10,000 freshwater shrimp, 1,000 bleak, whatever a bleak is, 100 perch, 10 northern pike, and 1 osprey. And this could also be an example of an energy pyramid, meaning that, remember, 10% is transferred from one trophic level to the next. You can see it's being reduced by about 10% each time. But a pyramid of numbers is simply how many individuals there are in each trophic level versus a pyramid of biomass, which is how much weight measured in kilograms is found in each trophic level, and how much energy measured in a kilocalorie or a joule, some unit of measure for energy. And that's what we use to demonstrate these different trophic levels. So that is our video lesson for today on food chains and food webs and energy producers, autotrophs. a lot of key terms in there. So we will, next class when we get together, we will be talking about how nutrients are recycled in the environment. So we'll see you next class.